Hey guys, been a bit since I did a video on here, but I wanted to talk about, I already recorded this, I accidentally deleted the video, and this should teach me a lesson to upload it right away. So, anyways, who could have replaced Hulk Hogan for the AWA? Now, we know that Hulk Hogan left the AWA December of '83. Well, he showed up on the WWF's TV taping in St. Louis on December 28th, '83. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, didn't he appear on the Thanksgiving show for Vern at St. Paul? I know he skipped some shows. And I think maybe November would have been his last month, technically. But he shows up in the AWA December 28th, St. Louis tapings at the Chase Plaza. And the AWA was never quite the same, but they were successful still. I would say from like 84 through Wrestle Rock 86, the AWA was still a major promotion. Wrestle Rock was really like the last hurrah where the AWA was major league, because, I mean, that card, look at all the talent they had on there. It was awesome talent. And then after that, they pretty much started going downhill. Hansen being stripped of the title, that wasn't a good look. Just awarding it to Bockwinkel. Doug Summers and Buddy Rose winning the AWA tag titles. That was not aesthetically a good look for a so-called major promotion. And from there, it just went downhill. But it was still they were still very vibrant during that time period, 84 through probably the first half of 86. And but what were the options for Vern in terms of replacing Hogan? Okay, we're gonna play that fantasy game, and I know Vince would have won anyways, so I'm gonna put that caveat out there, because that's what people say. Oh, Vince would have won. Well, we know that, but that doesn't necessarily prevent the AWA from having a few more good years before things really start contracting, because that's a whole nother story of why wrestling was doomed once it went national to fail in a big way, which it did for several years. So what are the options for Vern in terms of replacing Hogan? Now, we know Vern tried to do that with Sergeant Slaughter at the end of '84. He brought him in. Slaughter arrived on the scene. The AWA heavily hyped him up, and from what I heard, I mean, I was watching the AWA. They came out to LA, the TV show Pro Wrestling USA, right after WrestleMania 1. And I was watching AWA Wrestling. And I was a big Sergeant Slaughter fan, because we had WWF out here since like the beginning of '83, very end of '82. So I was watching WWF Wrestling. Love Slaughter, but apparently he didn't necessarily get over right away with the AWA crowd for whatever reason. Maybe because they had not witnessed his babyface turn when he was in the WWF, because WWF TV hadn't come out to the Twin Cities till, I think, sometime spring of '84, I think. And I guess it just, as good as Slaughter was, he might have been more committed to the G.I. Joe thing in his heart. And I don't think Sergeant Slaughter was necessarily the guy to carry the torch. Slaughter's gimmick was awesome as a babyface, but a lot of it depended on having foreign menacing hills to go against. And those, there's only so many of those. And like I said, by this time it seemed like Slaughter was getting more interested in the G.I. Joe thing and using wrestling as a vehicle to promote that rather than the other way around. Okay, but who else was out there, right? And this is my pick. I think the guy that could have carried the AWA through the 80s to where they could have been stayed major league longer, not necessarily that they would have won the war, because we know Vince was almighty and all-powerful in the wrestling world. But that doesn't mean that other promotions could have stayed around longer and survived longer had they made some better decisions, or, Now, with this pick that I'm going to make, you guys got to realize this is fantasy booking, okay? But I like to do, when I do fantasy booking, I like to do kind of somewhat realistic scenarios. Like, I'm not going to say, oh, Vern could have, you know. I like to just be realistic is what I'm saying. I don't like to do, like when I do fantasy booking, I don't like to say, okay, well, the promotion that I'm booking, we're going to get Hulk Hogan, you know. Obviously, you know, that's unrealistic, even in a fantasy scenario. You want to, that's what makes fantasy booking fun, is you keep it somewhat realistic. It forces you to be more creative. But anyways, the guy that I think would have been perfect for Vern, and for the promotion that he was a part of, was Kerry Von Erich. Now, Kerry had a 3-week reign with the NWA World Title in spring of '84. That was going to happen. Okay, so we're going to leave that as is. But what you don't realize is that as early as spring of '84, right after the title loss, there were rumors that Fritz was going to align with Vince, because in Vince's TV show, All American Wrestling, he featured the Von Erich brothers. That was '84, I believe, or it could have been '83, I don't know. In his magazine, which was in '84, WWF Magazine, he featured the Von Erich brothers. I don't know if it was Victory Magazine at that point or WWF Magazine. But he featured the Von Erich brothers in the title win of Kerry Von Erich at the Parade of Champions of Texas. And obviously, there's no doubt that Vince wanted Kerry. Kerry was right up Vince's alley in the type of wrestler, you know, the Greek kind of body, the Greek god body, the look. Probably wanted Kevin too, because Kevin, a lot of people forget how Kevin was over, could work in the ring, and he had a great look too. And so anyways, there are rumors that Fritz was going to pull out of the NWA and join with Vince as early as spring of '84. Now, at this time, the territories had a much stronger bargaining chip than they would in the future. World Class Championship Wrestling was on fire at this point, so Fritz definitely had leverage with Vince. Vince obviously wanted to take over the world, and he took over St. Louis. He would soon take over Toronto. Eventually, he would buy Georgia Championship, although that would fail, and he'd have to, sell it to Crockett. So why wouldn't Vince have an eye on World Class? Had Fritz joined up with Vince, I'm sure just World Class would have been absorbed into WWF instead of remaining separate. Who knows? Maybe it would have remained separate. I don't know. But nonetheless, Fritz was not happy with the NWA, and I believe one of the reasons was he knew that his sons would not likely get a run with the NWA title again. Why? Because politics were involved. Jim Crockett was starting to gain more and more power within the NWA, even as early as '84. And it was clear that Flair was going to be Crockett's guy of the '80s to be the mainstay of the NWA world title. Now, naturally, Fritz would think, it should be my son, because Kerry had the look, the charisma of Flair. Flair's Ric Flair. Plus, Fritz didn't like the lack of promotion from the territories when his son won the title. Like I said, there were a lot of politics behind the scenes of why the territories weren't really making a big deal of Kerry's win over Flair. Now, in this fantasy scenario, the fantasy part of this will be that we're going to pretend that Kerry never gets in that accident in 1986, that he stays away from drugs for the most part, okay, because I know that's going to be the comments, Kerry would have never been able to because of the drug. Well, we know that, okay, but let's just take those two things out. Okay. And Rick Martel is the AWA World Champion at this point. And we're going to keep that. And I love Rick Martel. I was a hardcore WWF fan by the time I started watching World Class, NWA, AWA, I all started watching those in the spring of '85. Up until WrestleMania 1, I thought WWF was the only wrestling organization. I was shocked when I found out there was other organizations. And I did that through flipping the channels on, UHF, Channel 56 KODC. Anybody from LA knows that station. And at first I was like turned off with NWA Wrestling, Worldwide Wrestling, NWA. And then I just loved it. By the end of 1985, I was more of a fan of AWA and NWA over WWF. But anyways, I loved Rick Martel. Immediately, he was my favorite champion out of Hogan and Flair. He was my favorite world champion. But for whatever reason, I think Martel was a solid champion. In '84, it doesn't seem like they really gave him a quality opponents aside from Bockwinkel. And of course, I think he had some rematches with Jumbo. But that's not going to draw in the US, In '85, he had a better array of opponents, more variety, and more, kind of more angles. Jimmy Garvin, Michael Hayes, who else? Obviously Stan Hansen. So I would have brought in Kerry around 1985. He was at his peak. Remember the Chicago Super Clash, Comiskey Park? Apparently a lot of the fans went there for Kerry. Because world-class wrestling, as you know, was nationwide in terms of their syndication. Right? Now, what I would have done, how I would have booked it, is I would have had Nick Bockwinkel beat Rick Martel for the title instead of Hansen. I would have Bockwinkel defeat Martel for the title, so that we can get a transition or a program built up with Kerry. I would have brought in Kerry. I would have aligned World Class with AWA. World Class was pulled out of the NWA, joined the AWA. The great thing about the AWA's schedule is that even though it was a full-time schedule, they weren't as hectic as much as Crockett or as Vince. And it wasn't as brutal as the travel schedules Mid-South in terms of driving to all these towns. It was a doable schedule. Kerry could have worked the AWA schedule along with World Class, obviously working important dates. I know World Class is full-time too, but he could have gone to the big shows in each. And, the AWA title would have had credibility. World Class, those fans knew what the AWA was. And what I would have done, again, transition the title to Bockwinkel. Have Bockwinkel beat Martel around the time Hansen did. I love Stan Hansen. I love the brawls that he had with Martel. They were phenomenal. Phenomenal brawls. Phenomenal angle on TV with Jerry O. But obviously Kerry Von Erich is Kerry Von Erich. I believe Kerry would have reinvigorated the AWA fan base and brought in the girls, the teenage girls in the Twin Cities, the traditional AWA areas, the teeny bopper fans. And I would have had Bockwinkel drop the title to Kerry Von Erich at Wrestle Rock 86. Imagine how many more fans would have gone. I think you could have got a legit... See, apparently they drew 22,000. We'll go with that number. I don't know if that's a kayfabe number. But I think they could have got promoted right, plus it's Kerry, they could have got in the late 20s, I think, and have Kerry go over Nick. And they could even rematch at Parade of Champions, you know, later on. That would have been like a couple weeks later. And I would have put the AWA World title on Kerry. And his schedule could have consisted of title defenses in the AWA territory and in world class. It would have benefited both promotions. They would have had a major world title instead of trying to create their own out of thin air, which never had, I wouldn't say it never had credibility, because, you know, I think the world class title had some credibility, but it was never not close, not near enough to where it would be considered a world title. And can you imagine Kerry wearing that big AWA belt? I love both AWA belts. I even have the replica of the one that, you know, Lawler, Kurt Hennig wore in Bockwinkel, like his last reign. But that big AWA title on Kerry Von Erich, that would have been lights out, man. And I think you had a number of wrestlers who were available in 86that the AWA could have used. Butch Reed was available before he went to WWF. Dr. D. David Schultz, you could have brought him in. The Fabulous Ones, you could have got them to wear the tag titles. You could have brought the Fabulous Ones as heels instead of Rose and Summers, and they could have had Sherry Martel as their manager, and they could have feuded with the Midnight Rockers. So I think it would have invigorated both promotions, and they could have worked together. Again, Kerry, it would have kept his drawing power alive more, because Kerry was a big draw in 85. Kerry was still in 85. He had that it. You started to notice in 86, even before his accident, and it's not because of Kerry's fault, it's because the promotion grew stale. They were still trying to run the Freebird Von Erich thing, and people just, I mean, that feud had run its course. Now again, I know Vince wins, but this is a little fantasy here. And even in my fantasy scenario, Vince still wins. But it would have kept the AWA solvent for much longer, I believe. Okay? This is provided Kerry doesn't have his drug problems and get, well, we know he doesn't get, in my scenario, he doesn't get in that accident. You got to remember, at the time, these promoters aren't thinking, oh, they don't see the future. Oh, this guy's going to be an accident. They have to make decisions that are going to be best for their promotion. And I love Stan Hansen, but that wasn't the best decision for Vern, right? It was with the ascendancy of Hulk Hogan nationwide through the WWF's promotion machine, it was clear that promotions needed a larger-than-life figure to lead the promotion. Crockett had it with Flair. Kerry could have been that for the AWA. So that's my scenario of what Vern could have done to keep the AWA major longer. But as soon as wrestling started going national, they were doomed. And that's a whole nother story. A whole nother long video. All right, bye.